And if you are a returning viewer or listener of the podcast, I welcome you back, and I hope that today's episode is one that you will find enlightening, informative, and insightful. So before we get to today's conversation, just want to remind folks to go ahead and click on that red subscribe button on YouTube if you're watching from there, so you can get notifications for future episodes and new content. You can also check out our previous episodes on our website at IDTALK4EDucators.com. And for our listeners who are listening with audio, make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts and all the streaming platforms. Thank you kindly. So today's guest is someone who is a phenomenal educator coming out of the great state of Oregon. She was this past year's Teacher of the Year in the state of Oregon, and she is a veteran educator who is doing a lot of great work in the equity space and advocating for young children, in her schools and beyond. And I just can't wait to just get into this conversation, because we're going to get into a lot of different topics, particularly about the issues and some of the challenges that specifically impact our Native students in K-12 schools, as well as teachers, but then also just some of the current events that have been going on throughout our country that have had a severe impact on the teacher working force. So we're going to get into a variety of different topics. So without further ado, I'd love to bring on Nicole Butler-Hooton onto the podcast to talk with us about her work and what's been going on with her. So let's get into this conversation. Hey, Nicole.
Jayla, Ushi Nicole Butler-Hooton, Ho'awanti. So glad to be here today with you.
Yes. And how's your day been so far? I know it's just starting.
It's early on a Sunday, a couple days before we head back into the grind. So just taking some time, and it feels good to be here to reflect on this work and to start my year off on a, positive note.
Yes. And for our viewers and listeners, if you wouldn't mind just letting everybody know which tribe you're enrolled in officially.
Yeah. So I introduced myself in my Dene language. I am a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz of Oregon. I'm part of the Chetco Band and the San Carlos Apache Tribe of Arizona.
Awesome. And thank you so much. Just want to give people some more context about your identity and where you're coming from. So thank you for getting on, this early in the morning to talk with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thinking about the way that I've come to embrace this role, this culture, all the things that you were saying as you introduced myself, it still hits close. And I'm excited to talk about what we can be doing in our classrooms and our spaces to support our Native students, to support all students, and to really think about what I want to share is how my resistance is part of my existence in being here with you all today.
Absolutely. We're going to get into that quite a bit. So before we do get into that, I'd like to start off by letting my guests just share a little bit about themselves and what ultimately brought them into the field of education.
So, as you said, I'm in the great state of Oregon, and I have lived here my whole entire life. I'm 40 years old, and I am a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz and San Carlos Apache, and so that's part of who I am. So you're going to hear me kind of reflect back on that, because this is a journey for me, and so I'm going to share with you all of that. I have two children. Avery is 10, and she'll be a 5th grader this year. Inspires me every day to be a better educator. And I have a son, Beckett, who's 6, and he'll be a 1st grader, which again, in the guidance that I see happening in the classrooms and the spaces he occupies helps elevate the work that I do. So I have taught 2nd grade and 4th grade for 15 years in my district. And this year I'm currently stepping out to do instructional coach / mentor teacher position. So I can really think about how we center equity in everything we do and how I've done that. So I often get asked, can you teach that? And so I get to think about standards aligned teaching, methodologies, asset-based learning, and how we identify the needs of teachers so that we can support them in the work that they do. So it feels really cool to be able to foster, collaborate, and work with new teachers. These will be teachers who have been new to the profession in the last 3 years, teachers who have been affected by COVID, and how we're going to rethink what collaboration models look like so that we can support teachers for longevity. Also, I have to put in there that my position will be to support BIPOC teachers, right? That's a passion of mine. And so I'm excited to be able to provide that. What brought me to education? Whew, that's a long question. That's a lot for me to think about for a moment. I feel like being true to my teacher heart started as a young girl. I was excited about learning. I was the oldest on both sides of my family, the oldest child of 3, both grandchild. I was the first grandchild. And so my grandparents often reminded me that I had authoritative skills and that I had passion in everything that I do. So I think that's what started my educational journey. I loved learning. I did not see educational equity happening in my classrooms, in my spaces, as if I just think back to my elementary years, right? If I just think back to those early years, we lived in a very white rural area in Oregon. So I was one of the only brown students in my school. We were one of the only Native families in my community. And I would say probably for many counties around the state. So what that felt like to live in a predominantly white area with negative stereotypes, Western perspective ideologies, how that felt to me and how I could reflect back as a pre-service teacher, if I think to my college years, I noticed time and spaces where I was able to be my authentic self. I can remember back to my PE teacher, K5, and her name was Mrs. Call. She lived around the corner from my grandparents. And so she saw a lot of the trauma that was happening and a lot of the dysfunction, if you will, in our families. And when I came to school every day, I never had to carry that, right? She let me be my true self. She made me feel like a partner with school. And so that's what I hope to do with my students, is to really think about the space that they're taking up when they walk in and to partner with families and to be whatever it is that they need. My family had historical trauma. We had resilience. I had a quest for knowledge. I'm here because of knowledge and acceptance of the dedication and the determination to be the very best version of myself and to be able to allow students a space where they can also feel that.
Wow. That may be one of the best introductions we've had on this podcast. A lot of different elements that you're sharing there. But I do want to talk about just the idea of how you felt, the belonging and the acceptance, because for a lot of Native students throughout K-12 schools, they don't feel that. And I know that, settler colonialism is something that is very much pervasive and prevalent through our society. We talk about it with respect to just the fact that as settler colonizers, we're occupying unceded lands, and we need to acknowledge that and also do things that will make our Native brothers and sisters visible to those who do not see them. So I'm interested in knowing from you, just from your perspective, in what ways does settler colonialism manifest itself within the K-12 school context, for those who may not be aware of what that looks like or sounds like?
Well, I think a passion of mine is to rethink the educational systems and how we provide Native perspective. And I know that we had talked about maybe a question coming up in the future about how we do that in our classrooms and how we really decolonize our classrooms. And it's coming from a place of acceptance. It's coming from the dedication to learning that you're going to give your students, whether that is a Native student, an African-American student, Latinx student, where you're providing spaces where they can be their authentic self. And although I didn't have teachers who probably even knew they were doing, the educational equity work, they met with me, they spent time with me, they helped me foster a love for learning, even in a system where I wasn't represented in. So there's really ways that we can think about decolonizing our systems by connecting with our students and partnering with them in very meaningful ways. And so dialogue, conversations home, how you're approaching families, the expectations that you have in your classroom, And of course, like if we're thinking about decolonizing, we're thinking about teaching true and accurate history, right? In my classroom, I start with land acknowledgement. We talk about the land a lot in my second grade classroom, and students understand what it means to be on land that is not technically their land, right? This is stolen land. We talk about acknowledgement, we talk about reclaiming, we talk about restoration. And so I just kind of wanted to think something when you were talking was bringing me back to, again, when I was struggling in first and second grade and how these teachers approached me and supported me and scaffolded learning and provided spaces where I could fail forward, I could make mistakes. And so I think when we start to decolonize our classrooms, we start to really embrace the existence of culture, and we start to remember and reflect on ways that are not Western perspective. And it takes time and it takes energy and it takes stepping into anti-bias work, right? And we can go on and on with that. But I think that our teaching methodologies need to reflect our populations, and we need to come from a perspective that is embracing our culture, the culture of our classroom, and the culture that needs to be taught in these ways that are new for some teachers, right? If we think about what anti-oppressive pedagogies really mean and how we can support teachers, that's why I'm so excited for this new role, because I'm going to get to do that. I'm going to get to align the methodologies that I've used in my classroom, that I've experienced as a young child, and support teachers in their culturally responsive teaching.
Awesome. So, with the new role, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you're going to be activating your funds of knowledge that you've been able to accumulate over your long career. And as you were talking about culture, I was thinking about this concept of culturally sustaining pedagogies, because that's something that we've been talking about a lot more often. So for those who are familiar with Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billen's work with culturally responsive teaching, and she's pretty much the godmother that we've seen it transition from that to culturally relevant teaching. And now we have culturally sustaining pedagogies, which Django Paris coined a few years back. And the whole purpose of it was to account for the linguistic identities and practices of people of color. And when we think about our native students and even our teachers, depending on what tribes they're coming from, they're coming with their own dialects and languages that they learned, from their homes, and they're not being honored in the schools. So I'm wondering, how do we achieve culturally sustaining pedagogy, within the native context? Because we know what it looks like for Latinx people. We know what it looks like for Black people, for Asian, Pacific Islander people, but we don't really talk about it for Indigenous people. So can you just share a little bit about what that can look like so we can have that vision of that?
Yeah, and when you're saying this, what's coming to me is, do we think that our native students, our native populations, deserve to be included in a comprehensive K-12 education? And the answer is yes. And so a big part of that is our language, right? I grew up never even knowing about the Dani language. I mean, what a disservice to my culture, what a disservice to my students. So now this is so amazing. My tribe, Confederated Tribes of Siletz, every week we have a weekly language class. And I actually have a lot of cards here because my daughter and I are practicing, how to say these words in our dialect. So yeah, are we including our native students, their dialect, their home language? Because if we're doing that for our other students, we need to be doing that for our native students. And we have to find a place to start. I was just delivering a talk to some admin and teachers up in Portland Public Schools area. And everybody has this question about where do we start? And so language is a way that we can find so many commonalities within each other, within our spaces for teaching and learning and growing. So yeah, if we're thinking about the pedagogy, we're thinking about where to start with language, right? Let's teach the language from a lens that allows us to accept and lean into this model where our native students feel accepted and part of the curriculum. Now, I always say that, as a teacher, we're continually trying to reach for things that we want to include in our classroom and represent our classroom spaces, right?
Absolutely.
Learning more about the the holidays and the culture of our students. And so I feel like that, yes, there needs to be a willingness and stepping into the discomfort of acknowledging that language for our Indigenous students is such a power place to be in. And we can come up with ways to navigate how to incorporate language into our K-12 systems so that students feel engaged, empowered, and we can start small with the language, because I feel like that can be overwhelming to teachers, especially when they're coming from a good place, but they know that there's parts of students' curriculum or students' culture that's left out. I'm really glad that you brought up language, because I think that's in Oregon. We're having a lot of conversations working with the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. There's a great deal of language restoration that's been going on in my own tribe for the last 20 years. We work closely with the language revitalizers in my tribe, and I often will invite them into my classrooms, and they'll teach my students Dene language, greetings, feelings, and my own children, ages 10 and 6, are really excited to have the language. And what power that is. You know, I think about my grandfather, who's been passed 5 years, and he's Silet's tribal member. I truly don't know that he would understand this platform of us talking about the importance of language, and that means a lot.
Yeah, and I think with language, that's the one thing that keeps us whole identity-wise. Like, as somebody who is a first-generation immigrant whose parents came from Ghana, West Africa, I didn't get the opportunity to learn my native tongue. And I'm approaching 40 years old, and I still can't speak my native tongue. And it really hurts me to the core, because now I have a son who's 3 and he's going on 4 in a couple months, and I'm not able to pass down the language to him. And that's something that I look at as a personal travesty, because, you know, language is just so important. It's so central to who we are as human beings.
And it's a small place to start, but like, we're starting with these note cards in my family, and it's powerful to be able to use a language that you know was built for you and that you know is part of your DNA.
Yes, absolutely. So I want to shift gears to our teachers. So I know that, you know, you are a proud alum of the University of Oregon. Go Ducks.
Go Ducks.
And I think they just won the national college basketball championship, I believe, the men's side, right?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
I believe they did. Yeah, I think they did. So,
but we just supported them in football yesterday. It was like we hadn't been to a football game with the pandemic for a year, and so we got to step back in Autzen Stadium and go to a football game yesterday with masks on, of course, and some distancing in place, and it felt really good to be back. College football here is big.
Yes, it's a good time to be in Oregon. So, defending national champs in men's basketball, and of course, the football team is always, you know, in the top 25. They're always doing well. But with regard to Oregon, I know you are a graduate of the Sapsik'ୱାڵá education program. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly.
Yes.
And I know it had a huge role in shaping who you are as an educator and the work that you've been doing throughout your entire career. So I'd love for you to just share a little bit about your experience in that program and how it allowed you to center your identity as an Indigenous educator, you know, in this education space.
Yeah, so Sapsik'ୱାڵá is a word that means teacher. It translates to teacher. And it's based on the belief that education strengthens our people. And we know that, right?
Yes.
Education strengthens our people. And so it is a program that was started in 2002. I attended the University of Oregon Sapsik'ୱାڵá in 2003. So I was the second year cohort coming through. And it really is aimed to address the needs of getting American Indian and Alaskan Native teachers into the K-12 systems. So it collaborates closely with the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon to deliver, we'll call them pathways for Indigenous studies, and so much support, right? Because as Native people, we need our community, we need our support. So I know when I stepped into this role in higher ed to obtain my master's degree, and it's a master's, I should say that, And just the support that I felt and the cultural values that were built into the program, it's hard to even put into words about what that did for my, for lack of a better word, culturally responsive lens. It's something that is a deep sense of pride because of the support and the roots that I gained in this program, the people I met, the advisors, where we could talk openly about culture, about heritage. It was a safe space, and I saw many people who looked like me, who had similar values, similar pathways, where there was a lot of roadblocks for us to get to where we are. And so really, I think going back to the idea of it strengthens our people, it has strengthened my work. It's strengthened my lens for how to go and do the work in systems and how to disrupt a narrative that we were previously taught. It's also, again, resilience and beauty is built into this program. So I took so much away from the Sapsik'ୱାłá program. I still am in contact with many of the people from our cohort. They actually gave me an award last year, and so that was neat to go back to have the first Educator of the Year award. I don't really know what I did to deserve that, but I guess presence and partnering and the work with the 9 federally recognized tribes, that's continued in my career into teaching, right? So that was 17 years ago, and then I've been able to keep, just more recently to go on a tangent, was last year, especially during COVID, right? They had a need for some Sapsik'ୱାłá teachers to come back and mentor some kids, some young adults ages 9th to freshmen in college. So we would meet with them once a week, and we would have curriculum and agendas, and we would teach about ways that we navigated the systems as Indigenous people. And so that mentorship, that was like just so amazing to think about continuing to diversify the teacher workforce, because we know that's so needed. And just providing mentorship, because that's what I received when I was in this program. And I feel like that's part of elevating the work that I do, is having supportive people who are there along the way to listen and to lean into it.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I know in my situation, I wasn't fortunate to go through a program where I was able to fully develop that culture responsive lens.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until I was in service, in the classroom, where I started to develop it through trial and error and just through going through a different number of experiences. So for you to be able to get that training off the bat before even entering the classroom is so powerful. And, we need more teacher education programs like that throughout our country and even beyond that.
Okay, well, I'm starting my doctoral program, and I would love to partner with the University of Oregon. Yeah, I'm 2 weeks in, so I'm just starting. I work closely with the U of O, the University of Oregon, on diversity advisory boards. And so, continuing to think about other universities across my state and how we can impact and share what's happening with Sapsik'ୱାłá, because you're right, it's a model that's very unique. And I don't hear about this happening, right? We've had over 100 graduates in 17 years representing 47 different tribes. So this is necessary work that we're doing. So as I navigate my higher ed, I'm thinking about leaning more towards that area of my career and my path versus the elementary side of things, because we're doing some great things. And so it's like, where else is there a need?
Wow. So first off, congratulations on the accolades. You are just way too humble. Just giving your resume and body of work, I know, is well deserved. And starting a doctoral program is super ambitious. And I just have a lot of respect for people who are able to go through that process of doing the research and writing out the dissertation and the thesis and just that whole process, because it's grueling and it can be emotionally and physically taxing, particularly if you have, families.
And are still trying to work and trying to balance. But I think that it's something I've wanted to do for the last 5 years since my grandmother passed. And so I think that inspiration I'm going to hold on to it as much as I can, because first generation college grad, I think the doctoral is something that speaks to my heart and the resilience of my family and of my culture. And so it's a lot to think about, but one class at a time, right?
That's it. One class at a time. Each class is a building block. So, no, you're right. That's the approach we have to take. So now let's talk about your work in the classroom. Actually, so after 15 years of being in the classroom, teaching second grade, correct?
Second and fourth, yes.
Second and fourth grade. You are now taking on a role as mentor teacher for different educators, particularly BIPOC educators within your district. So I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about these political conversations around the ban of critical race theory. We've been hearing a lot of talks about COVID-19 as far as mask mandates and vaccinations, and then just the overall racial climate we're in this country. There's a lot going on right now. So what I'm wondering is, in this new role, how do you plan on supporting teachers who I'm pretty sure are very anxious about what's going on in the world around us? So what are some priority areas that you definitely want to cover when supporting the teachers you'll be supporting this year?
I love this question because I think I plan to support teachers as best as I know how to, which is to focus on what they bring to the table, thinking about asset-based learning, thinking about how to encourage them to think critically about the world, address and celebrate the culture of their classrooms and what their families bring into their spaces. And something that I've always been encouraged to do is to teach from my heart and to teach from a place of community. So I hope to share my wealth of knowledge, my historical trauma. I hope to really think about how we can humanize the curriculum. And that was something I know we talked about earlier, but ways that we can lean into the discomfort of that. When I think about teaching Native studies, when I think about teaching about Indigenous people, I always talk about this, that it's really challenging for us to move forward in education without recognizing in our spaces as early as kindergarten the historical impacts of education on some of our communities, all of our communities of color, I'll say that. So acknowledgement, right? Talking about things that we may not be comfortable with at first. And so how we do that in meaningful ways for students as young as kindergarten, the impact is huge. But thinking about professional development, that has helped. Mentor text, right? I'm always reading and learning and growing my lens. And so I think in this new role, supporting teachers with the pandemic, with critical race theory in schools, which CRT, thinking about how we can disrupt the narrative of our marginalized students, families, how we can find more common language with norms, how we can collaborate and share stories. And I kind of keep going back to that idea of community, or the idea of I practice my culture because my ancestors weren't allowed to. And thinking about where our students come in, where we can meet them, where their story starts. I was watching this podcast, or this TED Talk, and then I got the honor to have Erin Jones come in and speak in a platform that I was in. And she said something that really has stuck with me. It doesn't matter where you start, it matters where you finish. And so with this work, as we think about the cultural climate, the racial climate of our country, taking into account systemic marginalization, bias, inequities, all of that in American history, I think what I want to encourage teachers to do is to lean into the work, do the heavy lift, and become the change makers that with my support, we can do this work. And the support of many others, I'll say as well, but just in my role, you mentioned.
All right. And it's a lot of work, but I know that you're going to bring a lot to the table, as well as the teachers who you'll be working with, because, they are coming with their own funds of knowledge. They come with their own expertise. So it's going to be a collective effort on both ends to, really create that atmosphere and culture for our students.
Yeah, and I've been reading a lot of books. This one is Coaching for Equity. And so thinking about a model that works for me and our district, right? Because we're designing this program from the ground up. And I know many districts have TOSAs, teachers on special assignment, where they are thinking of models that work for them, practices, rubrics, things like that. But it's really an amazing part to start something and build something that works for our culture in our community in the Bethel School District. We're also going to partner with the larger district in Eugene. And so I know that this is going to be a pathway that hopefully will continue to provide support for teachers, especially when we think alongside of what we want to disrupt in current practices, because I'm one to insert myself.
Oh no, I see that. I already see the proactivity and just the drive. So I know you're going to get other districts and educators involved, as well as our stakeholders,
Yeah.
parents, community members, and
Yes.
all those who matter in this education process.
Yeah, I mean, right. It doesn't just stop with us. And that's something that probably in the last 5 years, my work has propelled forward to, meet with the 9 federally recognized tribes and, really invite and be invited into space within the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I want to know what kinds of things they're doing, what kind of statewide initiatives. And so state level work is really important to this, and having a voice and feeling welcomed. And I've had that. So that feels good as well.
And speaking of state level work, I want to talk about House Bill 2845. So just from my research, I know that Oregon is the first state in the country to approve of an ethnic studies curriculum for K-12 grade levels. And that was about 4 years ago. So we've had a lot of conversation about ethnic studies. So there are a lot of states who are trying to do what Oregon has already done in terms of trying to get that curriculum enacted within their respective states. So I just wanted to know from you, just based on your experience as an educator, how much progress do you feel has been made since the approval of this ethnic studies curriculum? Do you feel like it's made a significant difference within different schools or even within the schools that you've taught in?
I really appreciate that question, because I feel like there's many components of that. How much progress have we made? Well, not enough, but we're on the path. We're doing the heavy lift. We're asking the questions. We're creating so many different pathways for diversifying Oregon's teacher network and workforce. And I know many states are coming alongside, but I'm going to speak about my district first. And so in my district, in the past 4 years, since we've come to adopt the ethnic studies state standards, we have done a great deal around Senate Bill 13, which is our Oregon's tribal shared history. So we've done professional development. We've worked closely with the 9 tribes. We've worked closely with the state level to really think about staff development for understanding Oregon's history of our first Indigenous people that were here, land acknowledgements. We've done professional development with Zaretta Hammond, Bettina Love, a lot of anti-racist work, and a lot of summits at the University of Oregon who have also fed into teachers coming to our district. So yes, there's a long road ahead, but we want to equip students and teachers with more perspective. And so that's what this bill is designed to do, is to give us more perspective, to think about propelling the work forward, inclusion. I know that in my district, really thinking about ways that we can provoke conversation around diversity, and we can think about anti-bias work. And we started, I think this was about 4 years ago, we started with something called an equity stance, where we had every administrator and every teacher, educator, EA talk about an equity stance, which is like their I am, I will, and I hope. Like what are your dreams for coming into the classroom? What are your biases? And so thinking about creating culturally responsive lessons, BIPOC support, lots of affinity group space happening. I've been part of the regional educators networks across the state, where we're doing so much for BIPOC within the last couple of years, and culturally responsive lessons, and asking, about intent and impact, and having discussions that previous to 5 years ago were happening on the sides. They weren't happening in these public platforms. And Oregon is thinking about grow your own pathways. I know that Sapsik'ວałá is one of those. And the Educator Advancement Council, I'm going to serve on that board as well. So I'll get to know more about the work that they're doing. But really thinking about educator workforce, pathways to learning, and supporting teachers in K-12 systems to be more interested, more invested in the work of our ethnic studies curriculum. So there's the Senate Bill 13, Oregon's Tribal Shared History, there's Holocaust, there's Asian, there's 5 different components there. Also working with like teaching tolerance standards and looking at those as well. There's still a lot of work to do, but it is exciting when I sit in platforms with teachers across the U.S. and I get to share what Oregon's doing, and I get to experience excitement from other educators that aren't seeing those things happening and are asking questions about how we can shift these programs to be more racially and culturally affirming for our students.
And I want to thank you for sharing this, because just from what I've read about Oregon, and I've been able to read up on what other states are doing in regards to just combating the racist propaganda that's being spewed out and everything else. But Oregon just seems to be more on the progressive side on a lot of these different issues compared to most states. And I know it's not perfect
Yeah.
and there's still a lot of work to be done, but relative to most states in our nation, I feel like Oregon is definitely a little bit ahead of the curve um, in a lot of different areas, particularly when we talk about ethnic studies and just anti-racist work. So,
Something that was really cool that I share a lot about to educators is thinking about, this is Indigenous Peoples Day, and how we celebrate Indigenous people in our communities and our schools and our systems. And something over the last couple of years that my district has done is we've taken, and when I say we, there's people that are doing this work more so than me, but part of the Bethel Native Parent Group, they're taking flags that recognize our 574 flags of all the federally recognized tribes across the United States. And they're representing those. They were small, and we put them up in the lawn on the Bethel School District administrative office. And we left them up for a day. We had a gathering, a song, a prayer. And so those kinds of things are happening in our districts. We're having land acknowledgement signs up. Our superintendent just came on. He's new to the district, and he had a Native parent come in and do a land acknowledgement. I like that he had authentic voice. We have youth empowerment groups in a neighboring district up near Portland. They're closely aligned with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and they're near a waterfall that was on some protected sacred land. And so they built a new school, and they were thinking of a name for the school, and they really took in the Sapsik'ୱାłá language of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and they went in a route to name the school Tumwater after this, with close relationship with the tribe. So things like that are happening here, and it is important work that we're doing. And so I'm grateful to acknowledge that, and I'm grateful to acknowledge that there's still a long road ahead, but the anti-racist work is happening here. We are talking about CRT. We are using language that's asset-based. We are trying to diversify our school boards, and we got our first person of color on our school board last 3 months ago. And so that was huge for us.
Nice. And with regard to just creating an ethnic studies curriculum, from the different guests I've had on this podcast, one thing that always been interested about is just this idea of representing the different historically marginalized groups equitably within the curriculum. So for instance, in California, they have their ethnic studies curriculum, but teachers and educators and other folks have been fighting for that curriculum for a long time before it was even approved by the state. And even when it was approved, there was very little representation of the Chicano community. There was little representation from the Jewish community, and they had their critiques on it. So it's going through this process of being revamped. So I'm just wondering, how do you create a curriculum that equitably represents all the different historically marginalized groups? And we can't forget our LGBTQ plus communities and other folks who are so often marginalized and underrepresented.
I think that's magic that happens. I truly do. I think it's magic that happens when we start thinking in community and we start thinking about our intent. And when we come to the classroom with where we're checking our bias, we're thinking about our policies, we're thinking about our practices. It's not going to be smooth. It's not going to be easy. I struggle with that every day, right? And so I think it's like starting with your culture unit and starting with a way that that you're honoring the work of your families and our marginalized populations, and you're learning and growing every single day. I know that recently we've been talking about making sure we're supporting our students and from our marginalized populations. And so the question is, well, how do we do it? And it's like, well, it takes time, it takes intent, it takes collaboration, it takes disrupting practices that are inequitable. And so finding your voice and thinking about what student success actually looks like. And so that might be putting your academics aside for a while, and that might be just the caring connection that you're creating. And so leaning into the work, I say that often to educators when I talk to them, because culturally responsive, teaching, anti-racist teaching, CRT, thinking about the academic frameworks that we navigate ourselves and we find ourselves in, we're always going to have situations where we feel that we need to do more, right? That's what we need to do as educators. And how are we supporting our families and students so that they feel part of the learning process? When my students walk out of my classroom, I want them to know that I'm not their teacher only for second grade. Like, I'm part of their learning career for the rest of their life. And so I think if we come from a place of intent and we keep finding these common language and norms that support our marginalized populations, we can all become part of the healing.
And I think that's the key right there. When we talk about anti-bias, anti-racist work, culturally responsive teaching, it's just this idea of leaning into the work. And I think so often we have a lot of educators who wait for the framework to be complete and they just basically rely on that. But the whole thing is it's a framework, which means that there's autonomy for you to make sense of what the different standards are, to create your own way of providing and delivering instruction to your students that still aligns with the main idea of the standard. But that's where teaching becomes an art form. And unfortunately, we have a lot of teachers who come out of teacher prep programs who aren't afforded that autonomy to develop their pedagogical toolbox, if you will. They're relying on the scope of sequence. They're relying on the scripts. They need that to stay alive. But I think that's where we tend to get into some problems because we're relying on this. We want a prescription. And when we're out there looking for prescriptions, we're not taking the initiative to build our capacity in the work and to learn.
And I appreciate you acknowledging that, because I think that there are programs that are happening across the state where teachers come in and they're ill-equipped. And so I'll say, like, something like, be fierce in this work, be a mentor, be a learner. And I like that you talked about liberatory design. That's something that I think I was doing in my practice before I knew that it was a thing. That's something with my lived experience that I'm going to bring into the classroom because I'm a person of color. And
Right.
because my lived experience has impacted me in a way that shows me that I need to fight for social justice. I need to insert myself. I'm not represented. We know that our Black and brown students are marginalized and we have to fight for them. And so just being, this is why I'm so excited about my the job that I'm stepping into, this role, is because I think it's going to be a model that I hope will be sustainable and will create these, or use ones that are already created, these racial justice tools, these models, these rubrics, these allowance for teachers to step into the work, to falter, but to come out stronger than before.
And that's definitely the key. And I have no issues with the equity toolkits and all these other resources because they're all important. But if we can get teachers to take it upon themselves to engage in the practice of liberation, engage in the practice of being anti-racist and anti-bias by taking those necessary steps so that they're not in this performative space where they're just doing it and going through the motions. I mean, that's really the goal.
Well, and I think that's part of, all of this is part of a bigger picture of, like, when we say, like, something that is important to me is to work with the fear and the discomfort and allow people to step into it. When I first started teaching Indigenous studies and things about my community, I'm not an expert. I don't know everything about my tribe. I don't know everything about my people. And so I often will remind myself and remind the educators that I work with that fear and discomfort is it means you're learning. It means you're growing. And how we attend to healing and how we step into the work of what it feels like to be with community that are oppressed, that's part of this growth. And so when I talk about these tools and these models and these rubrics, these are part of a healing process for what equity looks like in a larger system. And it's like that liberatory design for creating these spaces in our classrooms, the dialogue, the conversations, the partnership with families, how we're approaching essential skills for understanding. It's all part of it. And I know that there's work that needs to be done. I think the first part is that self-awareness that you mentioned.
Yes. self-awareness is key to doing this. We have to engage in that reflective practice. And, Dr. Yolanda Celia Ruiz, she talks to us about the archaeology of the self, where we're just doing that deep excavation of our identities and really digging into our internal souls to just really figure out why we have certain perceptions about race and gender identity, and how our upbringing has informed our practice as educators. So yeah, really digging into that work is really important.
And
So
I think people are often very cautious about using terms and models or ways of thinking that are different from their own, right? If we think about Western perspective, right, that's what we're trying to disrupt. And so, I had someone the other day say, is it okay if I use the word decolonize? And I was like, yeah, say it, talk it, really speak truth into that, because that's focus right there. And if we can do that more, we're going through those processes of remember, reclaim, restore, and that's healthy.
Right. And those are words that we have to adopt into our lexicon. And we're in a place where we can't censor truth.
Yeah.
Like we can't censor it at this point. And I know for many years, we've been conditioned to not speak the truth within our spaces because of maybe the fear of punishment, fear of being reprimanded or losing a job. But given what's going on, we just can't be in a place where we're censoring truth and not just speaking facts about what's happening around us, because, in the end, when we stay silent, the biggest victims are our children who are in front of us in our classrooms. So
yeah, I appreciate that. I think that, for many times I was comfortable with kind of being the watcher, if you will. And I think at different points in my career, watching and waiting for an invitation in. And then when the invitation comes, then thinking about, well, how do I be my true authentic self? How do I step into this role? And how do I give the people what they need? And it's like, no, I don't need to give them what they need. I need to speak my truth. I need to insert myself where I feel in my experience. And so I feel like that perspective, kind of going through those screening processes, if you will, those are no longer for me. And so I think we get into a spot where we feel empowered, amplified. And so that's what I hope to continue to revisit into these when I'm doing the mentorship with the Sapsik'ୱାłá, when I'm speaking to young children, is really to have them find their truth and stick with their truth. Because had I had my truth when I was my 5, 6, 7-year-old self, I would have found this a lot earlier. I would have found this space 15 years ago. So it's about speaking your truth. It's about standing for who you are, why it's important. I know I mentioned this earlier, but I think about my grandfather, and he drove like a white station wagon when I was in school, and it was kind of embarrassing. It was an older car, but on the back he had a bumper sticker before bumper stickers were even cool. And it said Indian and proud of it.
oh, that's
Yes,
that's
with
awesome.
with that bumper sticker, I think I kind of think back to that because I was embarrassed of that. I wasn't sure what that meant. And, being Native is part of who I am and still discovering. And so I think just about being your authentic self, being true to yourself, being focused in the work that you do.
Well, I think that's something that a lot of people of color share, that internalized racism that we all deal with because, we don't feel good about who we are, culturally, because we're going into spaces where we're being indoctrinated with westernized ideals and principles and ideologies. So it's normal for us to feel shame,
Mhm.
at least when we're growing up, when you see that bumper sticker, or when you hear your mom open, well, my mom open her mouth and her Ghanaian accent comes out, in front of my friends. Like, those times of embarrassment happen, but then over time you realize, no, this is who I am, and then you embrace and you capture that. So yeah, that's a story that we all have, even though it may sound different. We all deal with it.
Mhm. Yeah, can speak to that a bit. My grandmother, she didn't learn English until she was 16. She spoke her Apache language. And so up until the day she passed, 4 years ago, it was very challenging to understand her for other people, and so she had her own way of speaking English, I'll say. But Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate acknowledgement of our existence and what that looks like as we navigate these systems that we're disrupting. And I know when I spoke recently, I said my platform to them, my charge to them was to think about how are we strengthening the Indigenous presence. I'll say that again. How are we strengthening the Indigenous presence in our classrooms, in our spaces across the state? And so that's something that I'm passionate about, and that's something that's on my heart as we start the year, is really thinking about who's included, right? We're thinking about that. We're definitely always thinking about that, but strengthening our Indigenous presence in our classrooms, in our spaces, and leaning into that work.
And you've had a great opportunity to really do that work as the Oregon Teacher of the Year. So before we get into the lightning round, I'd love for you to just share how the honor has changed you and, really impacted the work that you're trying to do throughout the state. In terms of being able to be at closer proximity with lawmakers and elected officials to amplify these issues that we've been talking about for the past almost hour.
Has it gone? Well, that's gone fast. So the Teachers of the Year across the United States are the most incredible people that I've probably ever worked with and met. And so to be in their company it means so much. It's really uplifted the work that I do, and it's allowed me to see myself like I have a seat at the table. That's what I kind of think about with my own teaching is who has a seat at the table, whose voice is included. And these amazing educators, this amazing award by the state of Oregon has really amplified the work that I do. I don't know that it's changed my practice. I still feel like, I have the same agenda, if you will, goals, but it's given me opportunities, endless support from the state level, endless support from the State Teachers of the Year. That's sponsored by CCSSO, the Council of Chief State School Officers. And so I want to say in some ways it's made me feel more confident in finding my voice and thinking about my cultural values. And it's allowed me to partner with states and local advisory panels and educators and deliver talks and PDs and come from a place of commitment to the work that we're doing. So I'm really so grateful for being recognized as the Oregon State Teacher of the Year. And I do want to say the first Indigenous person to have this award feels really special and powerful.
Yes, you better let them know. You the first. Let them know. Talk that talk. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, Nicole, before we wrap things up, we want to do a quick lightning round where, we get to know a little bit about you outside of this education space, because one thing that I love to do on this podcast is humanize our educators. We need to let our young people and others know that we don't live in the classroom. We don't live on the screens. We do have lives that we live outside of those spaces. So, first question I'd love to ask you is, what is your favorite self-care activity right now?
So I'm kind of obsessed with running and working out. I love running. I love working out. I love that social emotional care and mental release. I also love getting massages. I have one scheduled this afternoon. And I'm not going to lie, I love a good pedicure. So I'm all about self-care over here.
That's what's up. And I was noticing with regard to your nails, you got the Oregon colors on. I see that you got that Oregon green on.
Dark green, yes. And
Yeah.
whenever I go back to school, I always have yellow. I don't know why. It's like a color that makes me feel like I can do this work and happy and cheerful. So yellow will be in a couple weeks.
Well, yellow represents sunshine, so you need yellow to brighten your day.
Yeah.
For sure. Yes. Is there a book you're currently reading or plan on reading?
So I love children's books. So I read every night with my kids. We'll read a ton of children's books. My daughter's just into the Harry Potter series, so we're kind of reading that together. It's not my fave, I'm not going to lie. But I'm also, I'm rereading Leilani Sabzillian's book called Indigenous Children's Survivance in Public Schools. I feel like I'm going to try to get some more inspiration. I've already read it once for my dissertation, to see if I want to go that direction. And then I'm also reading Coaching for Equity, Elena Aguilar. And then with my grad program, I'm starting a new one, which is Essential Guide to Critical Reading and Writing. So,
Ooh, well,
I got a few going.
Those are some great books.
Yeah.
And I see that you got your hands full. I don't know if you're a big TV watcher, but if you are, what is the most recent TV series or show that you've binge watched?
You know, I don't really have time for TV. I'm not gonna lie. I don't watch TV. I really don't. So if there's an occasional like cartoon in the background or something like that, or I mean, college football was on all day yesterday at my house. So, but I don't watch TV.
That's actually pretty good. That's how you're able to stay focused on this doctoral program. So that's actually not a bad habit to have. You're
You
not
know,
really
all
missing
my
too
friends,
much.
yeah, they'll talk about shows that they binge watch on Netflix or Hulu or any of those. I'm like, I don't watch TV. I really don't.
Right. And I think things have changed, to where you're either watching YouTube or Netflix or Hulu or one of those other platforms. You're not really watching, regular TV or cable. Like
Yeah.
people don't really do that anymore. All right. Last question. If you can invite 3 influential figures to dinner, dead or alive, who would they be?
This is a really challenging question for me to think about. I think what comes to my mind is the first person I would invite would be my grandmother. She passed away 4 years ago. She was a member, full-blooded San Carlos Apache tribal member. I would have loved to meet her mom and her sister and all of her family. We never went to Arizona. So next year we're going to take a trip and we're going to go and see where she grew up on the San Carlos reservation. I would love her to be here to see, this, to see the work that's happening in the climate, the cultural climate that's happening, and how Indigenous people are taking a stand and they're disrupting the narrative that she was taught. And I think, this would be really amazing for her to see. So I would love to see her again. And I know that she would be really touched by this. I also am going to go down that Indigenous pathway, and I'm going to think about a distant relative of ours, Geronimo, who was an Apache warrior, and he was an ancestor of ours, actually. And he talks about, in his journey, resistance, and he was a warrior and a medicine man. And I've always thought, I can't believe I'm related to him because, he was pretty forceful. And then maybe the last person, this is kind of funny, and I this is kind of like a stretch for me, but I was also thinking if I could meet an influential person that influenced me as a teenager and still today, it would be Tupac. I love his music. I feel inspired. I feel motivated still today, 25 years later. And I think that he was a storyteller and he was a genius in many ways. And so when I was thinking of this question, I thought, I'm going to say that. I'm going to be real. I love rap music. I love thinking about how Tupac changed the world, Geronimo, and my grandmother. So I think it'd be pretty cool to have time with them and maybe even all together.
That right there is a legendary table. And I'm just envisioning what type of conversations they're having across the table. I'm just envisioning it right now. Oh, but Nicole, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been amazing. And I know that your grandma is watching from above and is proud of everything that you're doing. And you're just setting a great example for your children and everybody else within your community. So I'll just say, just keep it up. And I know people out there are supporting what you're doing out in Oregon.
Well, I feel so supported, and I feel like, given platforms where we can be talking about ways that we can continue to do this work together and in community, and we can keep thinking about creative ways that we can humanize the curriculum and be present for our students and families, because we're going to need that. We're going to need to lean in, support educators, come up with systems that disrupt a previous narrative told, and I know that we can do it together. I appreciate this platform so much. I don't see myself as a public speaker. So when I come on these things, it's nice to be able to be reminded that this is power. And I appreciate all you're doing for elevating education and staying true to the teachers in us, because like I said, I still feel like I'm that same teacher, 15 years ago.
Absolutely. And I know that you have your hands in many buckets right now throughout your state. So we just let the viewers and listeners know how they can follow your work on social media and other platforms so they can continue to amplify the work that you're doing in Oregon and beyond, because this is powerful.
So I am not the best on Twitter, but my handle on Twitter is at Butler-Hooton, and Hooton is Hooton. And my IG for my Teacher of the Year story is in Butler Toy 2021. So those are two great ways to find me and to see what I'm up to.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. So you heard it, and we'll be sure to share those handles in the notes section when you read the liners for this episode. So, Nicole, once again, thank you for taking your early Sunday morning to talk with us. And I just wish you a good rest of the day with your family. And hopefully, we'll talk again soon.
I would love that. Thank you again. Ash
All
too,
right.
which means goodbye.
All right. Thank you. All right, people. So, there you have it. We're about to end another episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all a good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.